The emergency broadcast crackled through the abandoned radio station as Marcus Bennett's hands trembled over the microphone, knowing this would likely be the last transmission anyone would hear from Denver. Outside the reinforced windows, the city that had once thrived with over 2 million souls now burned in scattered fires, the smoke rising like funeral pyres against the crimson sunset. It had been exactly 47 days since Project Meridian went live, 47 days since the pharmaceutical giant Helios Corporation had promised to cure humanity's greatest affliction, death itself. Marcus watched the street below where dozens of figures shambled through the debris, their movements jerky and unnatural, their skin mottled with the telltale gray-green corruption that marked them as the undead. These weren't the zombies from the movies he'd watched as a kid. These were worse, faster during the night hours, and somehow retaining fragments of their former intelligence that made them terrifyingly effective hunters. He pressed the broadcast button one final time, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through his veins. This is Marcus Bennett, broadcasting from Station KDR-7 in Denver, Colorado. If anyone can hear this, head north to the Rocky Mountain National Park region. There are survivors gathering at the old military installation near Estes Park. Avoid the cities. Avoid anyone showing signs of the Meridian infection, gray veins, yellowing eyes, or the distinctive sweet smell like rotting fruit. They're not your loved ones anymore. A crash from the floor below made him freeze mid-sentence. They had found him. Marcus grabbed his emergency pack, already loaded with supplies he'd prepared for this inevitable moment, and moved toward the roof access ladder. His mind raced through the events that had led to this apocalypse. How Helios Corporation's regenerative gene therapy had been fast-tracked through FDA approval, how millions had lined up for the treatment that promised extended life and rapid healing, how the first cases of adverse reactions had been dismissed as isolated incidents. Dr. Rebecca Holland, the lead scientist who tried to blow the whistle, had been silenced and discredited, her warnings lost in the noise of corporate PR and government assurances. Now humanity was paying the price for its arrogance, for playing God without understanding the consequences. The infection didn't just reanimate the dead, it transformed the living into something caught between two states of existence, driven by an insatiable hunger for human flesh while retaining enough cognitive function to open doors, use simple tools and coordinate in horrifying pack formations. Marcus climbed onto the roof just as the door to the broadcast room splintered behind him. 3 of them poured through, a woman in a tattered business suit, a teenage boy still wearing his high school Letterman jacket, and an elderly man whose wedding ring caught the dying light. Their eyes, clouded with white film yet disturbingly aware, locked onto Marcus with predatory focus. He backed toward the edge of the building, measuring the distance to the adjacent rooftop. 8 feet, maybe 9. He'd been a track athlete in college, but that was 15 years and 30 pounds ago. The woman hissed, a sound that emerged from deep in her chest, and the others responded in kind, fanning out to cut off his escape routes. Marcus noticed the way they moved, coordinated, strategic, waiting for him to make the first move. This was what made the Meridian infected so deadly. They hunted with purpose, with remnants of human intelligence corrupted by an all-consuming hunger. He thought of his daughter, Emma, safely in Seattle with her mother when this all began, and prayed she had made it to one of the safe zones the military had established before communications went dark 3 weeks ago. The infected lunged simultaneously, and Marcus ran, his boots pounding against the tar roof as he pushed his body toward the gap between buildings. For a moment, he was airborne, the city spreading below him in all its ruined glory, the weight of his pack threatening to pull him down into the alley where more of the infected gathered like ants around spilled sugar. His hands caught the edge of the opposite building, pain shooting through his shoulders as his body slammed against the concrete wall. Marcus hauled himself up, gasping, and allowed himself one glance back at the radio station where the 3 infected stood at the edge, watching him with those terrible knowing eyes. They didn't follow, couldn't make the jump, but he knew they would find another way. They always did. As darkness fell over Denver, Marcus headed north, toward the mountains, toward hope, and toward whatever remained of humanity's chance for survival. The highway leading out of Denver had become a graveyard of abandoned vehicles, their doors hanging open like broken jaws, the interiors ransacked and stained with evidence of desperate final moments. Marcus navigated through the maze of cars as dawn broke over the mountains, painting the snow-capped peaks in shades of gold and pink that seemed obscenely beautiful given the horror that had consumed the world below. He'd been walking for 6 hours, his legs burning with exhaustion, when he heard the sound of an engine, the first sign of working machinery he'd encountered in days. Marcus dove behind an overturned semi-truck, his hand instinctively moving to the pistol he'd scavenged from a police cruiser, watching as a modified school bus painted in desert camouflage rumbled into view. The bus slowed and a voice called out through a speaker mounted on the roof. "We can see you behind the Peterbilt, friend. If you're infected, do us all a favor and stay hidden. If you're clean, you've got 10 seconds to show yourself before we move on." Marcus emerged slowly, hands raised, and found himself facing at least 4 rifle barrels protruding from reinforced windows of the bus. A woman appeared in the doorway, somewhere in her 50s with steel gray hair pulled back in a practical braid and eyes that had seen too much death to trust easily. "I'm clean," Marcus said, stopping 20 feet from the bus. "Left Denver last night, heading to the military installation near Estes Park." The woman studied him with the intensity of someone who'd learned that one mistake could cost everyone their lives. "Name's Patricia Cruz, former National Guard. We're heading to the same place, but we've got protocols. Strip to your underwear, turn around slowly, then stand in that spot for 2 minutes while we observe. The infection shows itself in body temperature. Infrared will tell us if you're cooking from the inside." Marcus complied, feeling vulnerable and exposed on the empty highway as the cold mountain air raised goosebumps on his skin. Through the bus windows he could see other survivors, a mix of ages and backgrounds, maybe 15 people total, all watching him with the same desperate hope that he might be genuine mixed with the fear that he might be their doom. Patricia consulted a handheld device, then nodded. "You're running cold, normal human range. Get dressed and get on board. We don't stop again until we're through Boulder, and if you're bit or scratched anywhere, now's the time to confess because we will find out." As Marcus climbed aboard the bus, he was struck by the organized efficiency of the group. The seats had been modified into sleeping quarters and storage areas, with supplies strapped down and weapons mounted at strategic intervals. A man about Marcus's age, with deep brown skin and tired eyes, extended his hand. "James Porter, formerly of Boulder General Hospital. I'm the closest thing we have to a doctor, which means I'll be checking you for bites, scratches, and any signs of infection. It's not personal, just survival." Marcus submitted to the examination while the bus rumbled northward, and James explained what they'd learned about the Meridian infection through terrible trial and error. The virus, or whatever Helios Corporation had created, spread through bodily fluids, bites, scratches, even prolonged exposure to infected blood. The transformation took between 4 to 12 hours depending on the victim's immune system, starting with fever and progressing to the distinctive gray veining before the final change occurred. "The worst part," James said quietly, "is that they remember. Not everything but enough. We've seen infected return to their homes, try to get to their families. There's something left inside them, some echo of who they were, but it's overridden by the hunger." Patricia called back from the driver's seat, her voice tense. "We've got company, people. Intersection ahead, maybe 20 of them, and they're organized." Marcus moved to the window and felt his stomach drop. The infected had created a roadblock using vehicles, and they stood waiting with an intelligence that sent chills down his spine. Among them he recognized clothing patterns, military uniforms, police gear, even what looked like SWAT equipment. "They're learning," Marcus whispered, "using the skills they had before." A younger woman named Kelly Rodriguez, who'd identified herself as a former Army corpsman, checked her rifle. "Then we better teach them that humanity hasn't forgotten how to fight back. Patricia, you remember that maneuver we discussed?" The bus's engine roared louder as Patricia shifted gears, and Marcus realized with growing dread that they were about to crash straight through the barricade, into the waiting horde of infected that had once been people, that had once been someone's family, friends, and neighbors. The impact shook every bone in Marcus's body as the reinforced front of the bus slammed into the makeshift barricade, metal shrieking against metal while the infected scattered with unnatural agility that defied their deteriorating bodies. Patricia kept her foot on the accelerator, the engine screaming as the bus pushed through a gap between 2 cars, its armored sides scraping against the obstacles while hands, some still wearing watches and wedding rings, clawed at the windows with desperate fury. Kelly and 3 other survivors fired through the gun ports, their shots precise and controlled, dropping infected that tried to climb onto the bus or block their path. Marcus grabbed a spare rifle, his hands remembering training from his brief stint in the Army Reserve a decade ago, and took position at a starboard window. Through the reinforced glass, He saw an infected woman in a postal worker's uniform running alongside the bus with impossible speed, her movements fluid despite the gray corruption spreading across her visible skin like spider webs. He aimed and fired, the shot catching her in the shoulder and spinning her away, but she was immediately replaced by two more, a coordinated effort that spoke to the horrifying evolution of the Meridian infection. James worked frantically at the back of the bus, tending to an older man named Gerald Thompson who'd been thrown against a support pole during the impact, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. "Just a cut, just a regular cut," Gerald kept repeating, his voice edged with the panic they all felt, because any injury now carried the weight of potential infection, the fear that you might become the monster you were fighting against. The bus finally broke free of the barricade, leaving the infected behind as Patricia pushed the vehicle to its maximum speed along the highway that climbed toward the mountains. Through the rear window, Marcus watched the infected giving chase for nearly a quarter mile before finally stopping, their group clustering together in what looked disturbingly like a discussion or debriefing. "They're getting smarter," Marcus said, and the silence that followed confirmed everyone else had noticed the same thing. Patricia glanced at him in the rearview mirror, her expression grim. 3 days ago they were just charging blindly at us. Yesterday they started using simple tools. Today, coordinated ambushes. Whatever Helios Corporation created, it's not static, it's evolving, adapting. A young man named Tyler Chin, who'd been monitoring a ham radio setup rigged to the bus's electrical system, suddenly sat up straight. "I'm getting something, a broadcast from the Estes Park installation. They're calling themselves Safe Zone 7, and they're confirming they have supplies, medical facilities, and defensible positions, but..." He trailed off, his face paling. "But what?" Kelly demanded, moving closer. "They're reporting that Safe Zones 2, 4, and 9 have gone dark in the last 72 hours. No communications, no responses. And they're saying the infection has reached Phase 3 mutation. The infected are now showing pack hierarchy behaviors, tool use and problem-solving capabilities equivalent to a 10-year-old child." The implications settled over the group like a death shroud. Marcus thought about the infected he'd seen at the roadblock, the way they'd positioned vehicles, created a tactical advantage, waited in ambush formation. If they continued to evolve, continued to develop intelligence while maintaining their strength and hunger, humanity's chances of survival decreased exponentially with each passing day. James finished bandaging Gerald's wound and addressed the group, his medical training making him the de facto voice of reason. "We need to understand what we're dealing with. Helios Corporation's Project Meridian was designed to activate dormant regenerative genes in human DNA, essentially allowing cells to repair and replicate indefinitely. But something went wrong. The treatment didn't just activate regeneration, it created a hybrid state where the body continues functioning after death, driven by the brainstem and whatever corrupted instructions the Meridian virus is writing into the neural pathways." A woman named Victoria Hayes, who'd identified herself as a former high school biology teacher, added her perspective. "If the infected are evolving, learning, and adapting, we're not just fighting zombies, we're fighting a new species that's competing with us for the top of the food chain. And they have numbers on their side." The bus climbed higher into the mountains, leaving the burning sprawl of Denver behind, but Marcus knew they weren't escaping the nightmare, they were just heading toward a different version of it. Safe Zone 7 represented hope, but also a concentration of human targets that the infected would inevitably assault. As they rounded a curve that offered a panoramic view of the valley below, Marcus saw smoke rising from dozens of communities, each one a testament to how quickly civilization had collapsed. The sun was fully risen now, and according to their observations, the infected were slower and more vulnerable during daylight hours, but nightfall was only 12 hours away, and the darkness belonged to the monsters that humanity had created in its desperate quest to conquer death. The entrance to Safe Zone 7 appeared through the mountain mist like something from a military fortress, with 20-foot concrete barriers topped with razor wire and guard towers manned by soldiers whose weapons never stopped scanning the tree line. Patricia brought the bus to a halt 50 yards from the main gate, where a painted line across the asphalt marked the boundary between hope and the wilderness that had become humanity's hunting ground. A voice boomed from speakers mounted on the wall, authoritative and weary in equal measure. "Occupants of the vehicle, exit one at a time with your hands visible. You will proceed to the decontamination zone for medical screening. Any deviation from these instructions will result in immediate defensive action." Marcus filed out with the others, his legs stiff from the journey, and found himself standing in a cordoned pathway marked by concrete barriers and armed guards wearing full hazmat gear. The soldier nearest to him, a young man whose name tape read Williams, gestured toward a series of white tents connected by sealed corridors. Welcome to Safe Zone 7. Population 843 as of this morning. We've got food, water, medical care and relative safety, but the price of admission is a full medical workup, a quarantine period of 24 hours, and absolute compliance with community rules. Anyone have a problem with that? Nobody spoke because the alternative was returning to the hell they'd just escaped. Marcus moved through the decontamination process in a daze, chemical showers that burned his skin, full-body examinations under lights that revealed every scar and blemish, blood draws and temperature monitoring while medical staff in protective gear asked questions about exposure, symptoms and contact with infected individuals. In the quarantine tent, separated from the others by plastic sheeting and hope, Marcus finally had time to process the magnitude of what had happened to the world. Through a clear panel, he could see the main compound, a former NORAD facility that had been expanded into a small town, with residential areas, farming plots under protective netting, and what looked like research laboratories staffed by people in white coats. A doctor approached his isolation cell, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes visible above her mask who introduced herself as Dr. Linda Martinez. Your blood work is clean, no sign of meridian infection, but we've learned to be cautious. The virus has a variant strain that can remain dormant for up to 36 hours before activation, which is why the quarantine period is non-negotiable. Marcus nodded, then asked the question that had been burning in his mind since they'd arrived. How long can a place like this hold out? I saw those infected at the roadblock. They're organizing, learning. What happens when they figure out how to breach these walls? Dr. Martinez's expression darkened, and she glanced around before leaning closer to the plastic barrier separating them. That's the question keeping Commander Harrison awake at night. We've been tracking the infection's evolution through reports from other safe zones before they went silent. The Meridian virus isn't just reanimating dead tissue, it's rewriting neural pathways, creating a hive mind effect where infected in proximity share information and coordinate actions. 3 days ago we repelled an assault by over 200 infected. They tested our defenses at multiple points, probed for weaknesses, then retreated when they encountered resistance. That's not mindless zombie behavior, that's tactical warfare. She pulled out a tablet showing Marcus video footage that made his blood run cold. The infected were building structures, crude shelters made from scavenged materials, organized into camps surrounding the safe zone at a distance. Among them, certain individuals stood out, marked with what looked like paint or mud, positioned at the center of groups, directing others through gestures and guttural vocalizations. We're calling them alphas, Dr. Martinez continued. Infected individuals who retain more of their cognitive function and seem to command the others. We don't know why some infected evolve this way while others remain more primitive, but the alphas are the key to their organizational structure. They're learning about us, studying our patterns, and we have reason to believe they're planning something. Through the tent's window, Marcus could see the sun beginning its descent toward the mountain peaks, and he thought about the night to come, about the infected waiting in the darkness beyond the walls, watching and planning with minds that grew more cunning with each passing day. In the adjacent quarantine cell, James was being briefed by another medical officer, while Kelly, Patricia, and the others underwent their own evaluations. They had reached sanctuary such as it was, but Marcus understood now that safety was an illusion, a temporary reprieve before the real war began. Dr. Martinez stood to leave then paused. There's something else you should know. We're not just trying to survive here, we're trying to find a cure. Helios Corporation's lead researcher, Dr. Rebecca Holland, is here. She escaped their facility before the government silenced her, and she's been working around the clock to understand what went wrong with Project Meridian and how to reverse it. If anyone can save what's left of humanity, it's her. Marcus's quarantine period ended with a green light on his medical monitor and the unsealing of his isolation cell, releasing him into the organized chaos of Safe Zone 7's main compound where survivors went about the business of preserving civilization with quiet determination. The community had established routines that mimicked normal life. Children attended makeshift schools and converted storage facilities, adults rotated through work assignments ranging from agricultural maintenance to guard duty, and every evening at 6 o'clock, Commander Dylan Harrison delivered updates on their situation from a platform in the central square. But today Marcus had been summoned to the research laboratory, where Dr. Rebecca Holland allegedly held the keys to understanding the nightmare that had consumed the world. He was escorted by a security officer named Angela Morrison through corridors that descended deep into the mountain, passing checkpoints where guards verified credentials with the seriousness of people protecting humanity's last hope. The laboratory itself was a converted missile command center, its walls now lined with equipment salvaged from hospitals, universities, and pharmaceutical facilities, all jury-rigged together in a desperate attempt to reverse-engineer a cure for the Meridian virus. Dr. Holland stood at a workstation surrounded by microscope displays and data screens, a woman in her early 60s whose gray hair and lined face spoke to the weight of responsibility she carried. She had created the monster, and now she was trying to kill it. She looked up as Marcus entered, her blue eyes sharp despite the exhaustion evident in every line of her body. "Mr. Bennett, I requested your presence because Dr. Martinez indicated you had direct observation of the infected's coordinated behavior, specifically the roadblock ambush outside Boulder. I need you to describe everything you saw in precise detail, how they moved, how they communicated, any patterns or hierarchical indicators." Marcus spent the next 20 minutes recounting the encounter while Dr. Holland's assistant, a young researcher named Michael Torres, took notes and pulled up maps showing other reported incidents of organized infected activity. When Marcus finished, Dr. Holland sat back with an expression that mixed scientific fascination with profound horror. "It's worse than I feared," she said quietly. "The Meridian virus was designed to activate telomerase production and stimulate stem cell regeneration throughout the body, essentially halting and reversing the aging process. But we failed to account for prion-like proteins that formed as a byproduct of the treatment, proteins that accumulated in neural tissue and began rewriting synaptic connections. The infected aren't just reanimated corpses, they're humans whose consciousness has been overwritten by a collective intelligence that uses their bodies as nodes in a distributed network." Michael pulled up a three-dimensional model of a human brain, highlighting areas in red that pulsed in synchronized patterns. "We've been analyzing tissue samples from infected casualties, and we've discovered something extraordinary and terrifying. The Meridian prion create new neural pathways that link to electromagnetic fields generated by other infected individuals within approximately a 2-mile radius. They're literally sharing sensory information, tactical data, and learned behaviors through a biological wireless network." Marcus felt his understanding of the threat shift and expand. "You're saying they're not individual zombies, they're all connected, all part of one larger organism?" Dr. Holland nodded grimly. "Exactly. And the alphas that Dr. Martinez mentioned are individuals whose brain chemistry allows them to process and coordinate information from multiple infected simultaneously. They're not leaders in the traditional sense. They're processors, central nodes that organize the collective's activities. Kill a regular infected, and you eliminate one unit. But kill an alpha, and you disrupt the network for potentially hundreds of others." She pulled up satellite imagery showing infected populations clustered around surviving human settlements, their distribution patterns forming geometric shapes that suggested intentional positioning. "They're not just hunting us randomly anymore, Mr. Bennett. They're besieging us, cutting off escape routes, monitoring our behaviors, and waiting for the right moment to strike. We estimate that within 6 months, the infected will have evolved sufficient organizational capacity to overwhelm our defenses through coordinated assault." The implications were staggering, transforming the apocalypse from a survival horror into a war against an enemy that grew stronger and smarter with each passing day while humanity's numbers dwindled. Marcus thought about his daughter Emma, about whether she'd made it to a safe zone or if she'd become part of the infected collective, her consciousness absorbed into the hive mind that Dr. Holland described. "Can you stop it?" he asked, hearing the desperation in his own voice. "Can you cure them or at least prevent the evolution?" Dr. Holland's expression held no comfort, only the hard truth of someone who understood the science too well. "I can try, Mr. Bennett. But I need test subjects, living infected that we can study in controlled conditions. Which means someone needs to go out there, beyond the walls, and capture alphas for research. Commander Harrison is assembling a team for exactly that purpose, and given your military background and recent experience with infected behavior, you're being considered for the mission. It's volunteer only, but I won't lie to you about the odds of survival." The briefing room filled with the kind of silence that preceded either acts of heroism or suicidal foolishness, and Marcus wasn't entirely sure which category their mission fell into as Commander Harrison outlined the plan to capture a living alpha specimen from the infected territory surrounding Safe Zone 7. The team assembled around the tactical display consisted of 8 volunteers. Marcus, Kelly Rodriguez with her Army combat experience, a former police detective named Robert Walsh whose knowledge of investigative work might help track infected patterns, 2 Special Forces veterans named Jackson Pierce and David Sullivan who'd been stationed at the facility when the outbreak began, Angela Morrison from security, and 2 civilians who'd proven themselves during rescue operations, a firefighter. named Chris Hammond, and a construction worker named Nina Petrov whose engineering skills had reinforced the zone's defenses. Commander Harrison, a career military officer whose silver hair and steady demeanor provided an anchor of authority in the chaos, pointed to a map showing thermal signatures clustered in what had once been the town of Lyons, about 15 miles from their position. Reconnaissance drones have identified this location as a major infected congregation point, with at least 3 individuals exhibiting alpha characteristics based on their central positioning and the movement patterns of surrounding infected. Your objective is to isolate and extract 1 alpha, alive and restrained, then return to the safe zone for Dr. Holland's research. Jackson Pierce, whose scarred hands and cold eyes spoke to extensive combat experience, asked the question everyone was thinking. And how exactly do we restrain something that has the strength of someone hopped up on PCP, feels no pain, and is connected to hundreds of other infected that will swarm our position the moment we engage? Dr. Holland stepped forward, presenting a device that looked like a modified cattle prod attached to a backpack battery. This is an electromagnetic pulse emitter tuned to the specific frequency we've observed in the infected's neural network. In theory, it should disrupt the connection between an alpha and the collective, temporarily isolating their consciousness and making them easier to restrain. In theory. The emphasis on those last 2 words did nothing to inspire confidence, but Marcus had already made his decision. He thought of Emma, of the possibility that understanding the infection could lead to a cure, could potentially save those who'd been transformed if any trace of their humanity remained trapped inside the collective consciousness. The team spent the next 4 hours preparing, checking weapons, testing communication equipment, reviewing extraction protocols, and receiving crash courses in infected behavior patterns from Dr. Martinez's research team. As darkness fell over the mountains, they gathered at the secondary gate on the north side of the compound, a smaller entrance used for patrol deployments that opened into the forest covering the mountainside. Patricia Cruz found Marcus as he was loading supplies into the armored vehicle they'd be using, her expression troubled. "I've been driving people to safety since this nightmare started, but what you're about to do is something else entirely. You're walking into their territory, their hunting ground, during the hours when they're strongest. Promise me you'll come back because we need people like you, people who can still think clearly when everything's going to hell." Marcus managed a weak smile. "I'll do my best. Keep monitoring those radio frequencies. If we find anything that might help, I'll transmit it back." The team departed Safe Zone 7 at 2000 hours, their vehicle running dark with night vision equipment guiding them down abandoned mountain roads where the forest pressed close on either side, full of shadows and the possibility of ambush. Through his night vision goggles, Marcus could see thermal signatures moving between the trees, infected individuals pacing their vehicle, tracking their progress but not attacking, as if reporting back to some central intelligence about the humans foolish enough to venture beyond the walls after dark. Robert Walsh monitored a portable version of Dr. Holland's scanning equipment, tracking the electromagnetic signatures that indicated infected presence and density. "I'm reading significant activity ahead, clustered around the town center. Multiple strong signals that could be alphas, and at least 200 peripheral contacts in the surrounding area." David Sullivan checked his rifle, his voice carrying the calm of someone who'd accepted the possibility of death long ago. 200 infected versus 8 humans in their territory at night. Either were the bravest people alive or the dumbest. Maybe both. The vehicle rolled to a stop at the outskirts of Lyons, where the main street stretched before them like a corridor into hell, lined with abandoned storefronts and overturned cars, and at the far end, barely visible in the darkness, a gathering of infected that turned in unison toward their arrival as if controlled by a single mind. Chris Hammond gripped his weapon tighter, his firefighter's instinct to run toward danger warring with human survival instinct to flee. "Well, we came here to get their attention. Looks like it worked." Commander Harrison's voice crackled through their radio, transmitted from the Safe Zone's command center. "Team leader, you are authorized to proceed. God be with you all." The infected moved with coordinated precision as the team advanced into Lyons, their formations parting to create a corridor that felt less like an opening and more like a trap being carefully laid. Kelly signaled for the team to halt, her tactical instincts screaming warnings that Marcus felt in his gut. They were being herded, studied, evaluated by an intelligence that had learned from previous encounters with armed humans. Through the electromagnetic scanner, Robert identified the alpha at the center of the congregation, a tall figure that had once been a man, now standing motionless in front of what had been the town's library, surrounded by infected that swayed in rhythmic patterns like worshippers before an altar. Nina whispered urgently into her radio, her engineering mind recognizing patterns in the structures the infected had built around the town square. They've created choke points, funnel zones that limit our movement options. This isn't random, it's urban warfare preparation. Jackson made the call that would define their mission. We split into 2 teams. Alpha Team draws their attention with a false assault from the east while Bravo Team flanks and deploys the electromagnetic pulse on the target. We get one shot at this before they adapt to our tactics. Marcus found himself on Bravo Team with Kelly, Angela, and Chris, moving through the shadows of abandoned buildings while Jackson's group opened fire, drawing the infected's attention with controlled bursts that dropped peripheral targets and created chaos in their formations. The plan worked for exactly 90 seconds before the Alpha demonstrated why Dr. Holland had called them processors. It coordinated a counter-response that sent half the infected toward Jackson's position while maintaining a defensive perimeter around itself, as if anticipating the flanking maneuver. "They're learning in real time," Kelly breathed, but there was no option to retreat now. Chris used his firefighter's experience with building layouts to find them and approach through a collapsed storefront that brought them within 20 yards of the Alpha, close enough to see the gray corruption mapping its skin in geometric patterns, close enough to see its eyes, still holding fragments of human awareness trapped behind the infection's control. Angela deployed the electromagnetic pulse emitter, the device humming to life with a frequency that made Marcus's teeth ache, and the effect on the infected was immediate and catastrophic to their coordination. The Alpha stumbled, its connection to the collective severing with an almost audible snap, while the surrounding infected froze in confusion like puppets whose strings had been cut. The team moved with practiced efficiency. Restraints designed by Nina locked around the Alpha's limbs while a hood lined with signal-blocking material cut off its ability to reconnect with the hive mind. But the infected weren't defeated, only disrupted, and as the team retreated toward the extraction vehicle with their captive, the collective adapted, surging forward in a wave of corrupted humanity that cared nothing for individual survival, only for recovering the node that had been taken from their network. The firefight that followed was brutal and desperate, the team fighting their way back to the vehicle while carrying the thrashing Alpha between them, burning through ammunition as infected threw themselves forward with suicidal determination. David took a wound to his shoulder from an infected that moved with terrible speed, but Angela dragged him forward while Marcus and Kelly provided covering fire that painted the street in muzzle flashes and falling bodies. They reached the vehicle with the infected mere seconds behind, and Robert floored the accelerator, the armored transport smashing through grasping hands and deteriorating bodies as they raced back towards Safe Zone 7. The infected gave chase for 3 miles before finally stopping at an invisible boundary, as if the collective had calculated that pursuing further offered diminishing returns. In the back of the vehicle, Dr. Holland's equipment confirmed that the Alpha remained isolated from the hive mind, its neural patterns chaotic and individual rather than synchronized with the collective. Commander Harrison's voice came through the radio, thick with relief. "Outstanding work, team. You've given us a fighting chance." But as Safe Zone 7's walls came into view and dawn broke over the Rocky Mountains, Marcus understood that they had won a battle, not the war. The infected would adapt to the electromagnetic disruption, would evolve countermeasures, would continue their siege with the patience of a species that didn't tire or despair. Yet for the first time since the Meridian outbreak had begun, humanity had struck back with purpose and gained ground in understanding their enemy. Dr. Holland would have her test subject, her chance to find weaknesses in the infection and perhaps develop a cure or vaccine. Marcus thought of Emma, of Patricia and the others at the safe zone, of the 843 souls who depended on this research succeeding. The apocalypse wasn't over, but neither was humanity's fight for survival. As he helped carry the restrained Alpha into the research facility's secured containment area, Marcus realized that the forgotten dawn, the moment when humanity had unleashed this plague upon itself, was being answered by a new dawn, one where survivors chose to face the shadows of their own creation not with despair, but with defiance. The dead had risen, had evolved, had nearly destroyed civilization, but the living would adapt as well, would fight with intelligence and courage and the stubborn refusal to surrender that had always defined the human species at its best. Outside the containment lab's reinforced windows, the sun climbed higher, driving back the darkness where the infected waited, and in that light, Marcus allowed himself to hope that perhaps the forgotten dawn would not be humanity's end, but its crucible, the fire that would forge survivors into something strong enough to reclaim their world from the monsters they had created. The end.